Hi, and welcome to the last module of this class. This is World Englishes, and it really happens to be one of my favorite modules of this class because obviously we are at this era right now. We are in the era of World Englishes, so it's really exciting to talk about that. So we talked in the last module about how English became a global language and how English started to become a lingua franca. But when we really talk about language variation, we're really talking about different dialects of English. And so you can talk about dialects of English either from a regional or a geographical standpoint or from a social or ethnic standpoint. So let's look at these two dialects in detail. So when you talk about regional dialects, you're often talking about regional differences in speech. So in America, you can talk about Northern dialects, North Midland, South Midland, Southern dialect, etc. And obviously, you know that these dialects have different grammatical structures or different vocabulary, etc. And they sound really different. So the accents in these different dialects are very different. The study on American dialects is rather new, and it began with the formation of the American Dialect Society in 1889, and they were in charge of the production of the American Dialect Dictionary, as well as a linguist atlas of the United States and Canada. And we saw a little bit of this in 315 as well. The ethnic and the social dialects, for instance, are dialects that are influenced by Hispanic communities, for example, or by communities that have a connection with other race and other ethnic communities. So like the Cuban dialect or the Texan dialect or the Californian dialect or German influenced dialects such as Pennsylvania Dutch in Pennsylvania. And we have the most important social dialect of all times, which is the African American Vernacular English, also known as AVE, an ethnic dialect with social class distinctions. I'm going to talk to you in detail about African American Vernacular English because I think it's going to be relevant for you, especially most of you who will be working in school districts in and around Wichita and will be encountering students who may be native speakers of African American Vernacular English. African American Vernacular English pronunciation is systematic and it's different from Standard English, but it is in no means people who are talking in a lazy format or people who are talking in an uneducated format. So I don't want you to harbor any of those feelings. And I want you to talk about this in class, in your classes, in a very structured format, such as pronunciation. Consonant cluster simplification is something that African American vernacular people do. Loss of the R and the TH conversion. I'll take each of these in a minute to explain. Let's look at consonant cluster simplification. So very often, consonant clusters in the coda position of the words are kind of deleted. So if you have kept, very often African American vernacular English people say kept, right, without the t. Or best becomes best, coal becomes coal, etc. So this is something that you see very often in African American vernacular English speech, something that you don't see very often in Standard English. But sometimes you do see it in colloquial speech. So something like last night in certain varieties of English becomes last night, right? You kind of drop the t. So it does happen in certain instances of English, but very often you call these colloquial forms of English. Now, they also simplify consonants at the end of a sentence. So she came in last, and they simplify consonants before words beginning with vowel. So they found a lost elephant, right? So you drop the d, it's a consonant cluster in found, and lost, right? The t, right? So if you have elephant, elephant starts with a vowel, and so the t, they found a lost, that t is dropped, right? Beginning with the vowel. Lots of R, so very often they drop the R at the end of the word, so they don't say car, they say ka. Or they leave out R between two vowel sounds. So instead of carol, they say cow, 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 right? Without the R, so unlike carol, carol, right? And the TH conversion, very often the African American vernacular speakers convert TH sound to D. So this becomes dis, right? And you very often hear this in rap versions, but if you listen closely to African American people speaking with each other, you can actually hear that this is something that is very common across the language, across the dialect. Syntactically, they also have systematic properties that are rule governed, loss of verbal inflections, double negation, subject form for it, question inversion, don't in sentence initial position, and the omission of be. Let's start with the first one, loss of verbal inflection. Many speakers don't have the S form to the verb. So they say something like he go instead of he goes, or she see him instead of she sees him. It's a very regular pattern for them to drop this S on the verb. They also use double negation. This is something that we've talked about, but something that I want to talk about is the fact that, well, double negation is actually very common in other languages of the world. So Italian, Spanish, Hausa, Burmese, the example that I have is from Italian, non ho visto niente. I didn't see anything. Literally, I didn't see nothing, right? So that kind of double negation is very common across other Romance languages. English lost it, right? After the early modern English period. Shakespeare would still write with double negation. People would still use double negation, but we lost it. But now it's kind of become a stigma, right? But that stigma is coming from the social standing point of view, from the race point of view, from the class point of view, and not from the fact that double negation itself is linguistically wrong. African American speakers use it as a subject. So it's a boy in my class called John versus there's a boy in my class called John, right? So this is something that standard English speakers, again, do not like. Question inversion. So they put auxiliary verbs such as have and do before the subject. So I asked Mary, where did she go? I want to know, did he arrive last night, right? So putting auxiliary verbs have and do before the subjects. Don't in a sentence initial position. So something like don't nobody know John took it, right? Versus doesn't anybody know that John took it, right? Don't nobody. So again, it's a double negation, right? But also the fact that you can actually put this don't in a sentence initial position. Omission of the copula be. So this is when you have things like she is real nice, he is the boss, and then you drop that and you get she real nice and he the boss. Now, I want to talk about how African-American vernacular English can play a role in the classroom because, again, like I said, many of you will become teachers in the future, and this is something that I really want you to think about. It is a known fact that African-American vernacular English-speaking children often lag behind their peers who speak standard American dialects of English in terms of reading and writing. And this is really because of a difference between African-American vernacular English and standard English, as you just saw from what I just showed you, that there are systematic differences between AAVE and standard English. There have been 3 solutions that have been proposed to resolve this issue. And the first is the elimination of non-standard speech. So this is a situation that was very common in the beginning of the 20th century. For example, when people had a lot of stigma associated with African-American vernacular English, and they would say, well, we all should speak standard English, so you should stop speaking the vernacular. And this is a wrong approach because A, it's not practical because obviously the children go back home and speak their own dialect. And 2, it's often criticized as being psychologically wrong. The second is called bidialectalism, and this is basically, well, the children have to take pride in the language that they speak. So if you're an African-American vernacular English speaker, you take pride in that particular dialect. But they're encouraged to use it with a particular sect of people, like with their family, with their friends back home. But in school, they use standard English. So it's basically like you have 2 different dialects in your head, and you use one and not the other in certain kinds of situations. This is quite common in Switzerland, Germany, Italy, where you often have a high German, low German, or a high Italian, low Italian kind of distinction with dialects. Again, kind of mandated by race and regional differences in speech. But again, this is not something that I've seen quite often used in America, just because, again, of the stigma that is associated with African-American vernacular English. And the last option is a utopian approach where, well, society has to change attitudes towards African-American vernacular English, and all non-standard dialects should be considered equal and respected. Obviously, this is a utopian approach because this is not something that I see happening in the near future, but obviously bidialectalism is something that I think all of you as educators can encourage in your own classrooms. So here is a poem that one of my previous English Linguistics 317 student who is now a teacher in one of the school districts. One of her students actually wrote, and she sent me a mail saying that she really remembered the lecture, the African American Vernacular English lecture from 317, when she saw this poem, because obviously the student who wanted to write this poem was afraid that my previous student, his teacher, would mark him down. And she said, no, of course not. You can write in whatever dialect you want. So I thought that was really a nice gesture of her, and something that I think she learned from taking 317. So, all right. So when we talk about world Englishes, you can talk about 3 different ways in which English is a first language. English is currently being used in the world. A as a first language, B as a second language, and 3 as a foreign language. So we talk about certain circles of world English. So you can talk about the inner circle. These are countries that predominantly speak English and have English as a first language, like USA and UK. And then you have the outer circle, which is also languages that have a colonization history, languages where English is an official language, like India and Singapore. And then you have the expanding circle, which are languages that are learning English as a foreign language, that don't have a history of colonization, that don't have English as first language speakers, for example. Now we come to the second dialect of English that I actually wanted to talk about in this video, which is Irish English. Many of you might be familiar with Irish English, having taken other literature classes at Wichita State, so I'm not going to say much about the literature point. You can take other classes to talk about the literature, but obviously we have a lot of Irish people in mainstream English literature. We talked about Swift and Sheridan, but we also have poets Yeats and Joyce and Samuel Beckett, for instance. Now, how is Irish English different from British English? Well, Irish English is a historical development of 17th century British and Scottish English. So it is a more recent variety of English. So it's very similar in its development to American English in that it's more recent. But obviously, there existed other languages in Ireland. We've talked about it in class, such as Gaelic, for example. And so there was something called the Middle Irish English that existed in Ireland, and this was around the 16th century, and this was replaced by the modern Irish English, which was the language of the Tudors from like the early modern English era. So the characteristics of Irish English is that, well, there are certain vowel pronunciations that are very similar to Old English, so tay, mate, aise, stale, right? So where you kind of keep the a kind of sound from before the great vowel shift, right? So that's something which is very particular to Irish English. Stress falls in different words than in standard English. So you have affluence and architecture, right, where stress is on the penultimate syllable. So on the first word, it's on flu, and on the second word, it's on tech, right? And that's different from standard American English stress patterns. They have grammatical constructions such as with do and be to indicate habitual action. So you can say he does work, he bees working, he does be working, etc., which really sound archaic and which sounds like Old English, right, more than modern English. And they also avoid perfect tense. So she is after talking with him, kind of like she has just finished talking with him, right? She is after talking with him. They also use the cleft construction more than standard English. It is a long time that I am waiting. It is a long time that I am waiting. So the use of the cleft construction signaled by the that. Use of rhetorical questions such as whenever I listened, didn't I hear the sound of him sleeping? Conjunction and used before participles. He was after waking up, and she pounding on the door with all her might. So that's all I have to say about African American Vernacular English and Irish English, and the next lecture will be about Indian English and Singaporean English.